I live in a small, quiet neighborhood at the edge of a dense forest, the kind of place where the streets are lined with maple trees and the air always carries a hint of pine. My house sits at the end of a cul-de-sac with a long gravel driveway leading up to my detached garage, which is my sanctuary. My neighbors are decent folks, mostly families with kids or retirees tending to their gardens. But then there's Karen. Karen is the self-appointed queen of the block, the type who thinks her property line extends to everyone else's lawn, and she's never without her little white poodle, Priscilla, whose yapping echoes like a poltergeist wail through the crisp evening air. It all started on a chilly October night, just as the fog began to creep in, swirling around the base of the streetlights like ghostly tendrils. I had just returned from a late-night run to the hardware store, the back of my old Chevy truck, loaded with planks, nails, and a fresh can of black paint for a project I had planned in my garage. I pulled into my driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires. When I saw it, Karen's white minivan parked squarely in front of my driveway, completely blocking me in. Now, I'm a patient guy, but this was the third time this month she'd done this, and each time she'd found some absurd excuse for it. The first time she said she was just borrowing my driveway for a moment while her landscapers cleared her leaves, but her driveway was clear and I never saw any landscapers. The second time she claimed Priscilla had run off and she had to park quickly to chase after her, even though Priscilla was securely perched in her arms, wrapped in a pink bedazzled sweater when she said this. But this time there was no excuse. It was late, the street was empty, and there were at least 3 other open parking spots right in front of her own house. I stepped out of my truck, my breath fogging in the cool night air, and marched up to her front door. I knocked, each rap on the frosted glass a little harder than the last, until finally the door creaked open, revealing Karen in her signature get-up, fluffy pink robe, her graying hair pulled back in tight curlers, and a steaming cup of herbal tea in one hand. She peered at me over the rim of her glasses, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line, as if I were the one inconveniencing her. "Karen," I said, doing my best to keep my tone civil, "your van is blocking my driveway. Can you please move it?" She took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea, her eyes never leaving mine. "Oh, that's your truck," she said, her voice dripping with mock surprise. "I thought it was just some old junk someone abandoned." I felt my jaw clench, my fingers curling into fists at my sides, but I forced a smile. "Yes, it's mine," I replied, my voice tight. "Could you move your van, please? It's late, and I've got work to do." She sighed, rolling her eyes dramatically, like I'd just asked her to move a mountain. "I'll move it when I feel like it," she said, and before I could respond, she shut the door in my face, the sharp clink of the latch echoing in the cold night air. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming in short, angry puffs, before I turned back to my truck, muttering under my breath about entitled neighbors and their ridiculous antics. I decided to let it slide, figuring I'd confront her in the morning when my head was a little cooler. But as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the cracked ceiling of my old house, my mind kept replaying the smug look on her face, her dismissive tone, the way she treated my property like her personal convenience. I woke the next morning to the sound of Priscilla barking furiously, the high-pitched yaps echoing through the still morning air. I peered through my bedroom window and saw Karen, wrapped in a fur-lined coat now, pacing in front of my driveway, her van still parked there, as if mocking me. That was it. I was done being the nice guy. I stormed outside, still in my flannel pajama pants and a threadbare t-shirt, my breath steaming in the crisp autumn air. "Karen," I called, my voice sharper than I intended, "move your van, or I'm having it towed." She spun around, eyes flashing with indignant surprise, her cheeks flushed pink against the morning chill. "How dare you threaten me?" she snapped, clutching Priscilla to her chest like a protective talisman. "This is a public street, and I have every right to park wherever I want." I felt a dark, simmering anger boiling in my chest, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. "You're blocking my driveway, Karen," I said, my voice lower now, more controlled. "It's not just about where you park, it's about respect." She scoffed, tossing her head back with a dramatic flick of her wrist. "Respect?" she spat. "You live in that shack with your rusty old truck and your creepy garage. Maybe if you kept your property a little nicer, I'd consider moving my van." And with that, she turned on her heel, her robe flapping behind her like the wings of some overgrown, angry pigeon, and disappeared back into her house, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming in short, angry bursts, before I turned back to my house, the wheels in my mind already turning. Fine, I thought. If she wanted to play this game, I'd play. And I had just the thing in my garage to make sure she'd never block my driveway again. I walked back to my garage, my boots crunching against the gravel, and threw open the creaky metal door. Inside, the shadows stretched long and dark, my tools hanging from the walls like the fangs of some ancient, mechanical beast. I smiled, a slow, wicked grin spreading across my face. If Karen thought she could haunt my life, then maybe it was time to introduce her to a few ghosts of my own. I spent the rest of that morning pacing around my kitchen, the old linoleum creaking beneath my bare feet, as I mulled over my options. I could call the cops, sure, but I'd dealt with this kind of passive-aggressive behavior from Karen before, and I knew she had a way of spinning every situation to make herself look like the victim. No, I needed something better, something that would send a clear message without turning the whole neighborhood against me. As I leaned against the chipped countertop, staring out the foggy window at her minivan still parked in front of my driveway, an idea began to form in the back of my mind, something that had been gathering dust in the farthest corners of my garage for years. I threw on a pair of jeans and a thick flannel shirt, my breath still coming in sharp, angry puffs as I crossed the gravel driveway to my garage, the early morning air biting at my skin. The old metal door groaned as I pulled it open, the rusty hinges protesting the sudden movement, and the familiar smell of oil, metal, and aged wood filled my nose. The inside of my garage is a chaotic mix of tools, old car parts, and forgotten projects, each piece a relic of a life spent fixing things, engines, bikes, even the occasional broken lawnmower for the neighbors. But in the far corner, hidden beneath a thick, dust-covered tarp, lay my secret weapon, an old, handcrafted Halloween prop I had built years ago for the neighborhood's haunted house tour. I hadn't used it in years, but it was still in perfect working order. A life-sized, ghostly figure, complete with glowing red eyes, a motion-activated smoke machine, and a built-in speaker that played a loop of chilling whispers and ghostly wails. I pulled the tarp off with a dramatic flourish, dust motes dancing in the slanted beams of sunlight streaming through the cracked garage window, and grinned as I looked down at my creation. It was a grotesque thing pieced together from old mannequin parts, plastic bones, and strips of tattered cloth that I had painstakingly painted to look like rotting flesh. I had even added long, spindly fingers made from twisted wire and covered in latex, each one ending in a sharp claw-like point. I spent the next few hours testing the circuits, replacing a few corroded wires, and tweaking the motion sensor to make sure it would trigger at just the right moment. I wanted this thing to come to life the second Karen or her yappy little dog got too close. As I worked, I could feel my earlier anger slowly transforming into something else, a wicked, vengeful satisfaction that made my heart beat a little faster. By the time I finished, the sun was high in the sky, casting sharp, angular shadows across my driveway. I stepped back to admire my handiwork, the ghost figure now standing tall and menacing in the center of my garage, its hollow eye sockets staring back at me like the empty, accusing gaze of some long-forgotten spirit. I wiped the sweat from my brow, a wicked grin spreading across my face, and took a step back, grabbing my phone to set up a small, hidden camera in the corner of the garage. If I was going to scare the living daylights out of Karen, I wanted to make sure I captured every second of it. That night, I waited. I sat in my darkened living room, the only light coming from the flickering screen of my security monitor, my heart thudding in my chest as I watched the grainy black and white feed from my garage camera. Hours passed, the shadows outside stretching and twisting as the moon rose high above the trees, casting its cold, silvery light across the neighborhood. I had just started to doze off when I heard it, the familiar high-pitched yapping of Priscilla, followed by the slow, deliberate crunch of gravel beneath tires. My pulse quickened, and I leaned forward, my eyes locked on the monitor as Karen's minivan crept into view, its headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of some great mechanical beast. She pulled up in front of my driveway, her tires barely a few inches from the entrance to my garage, and I watched as her door swung open, her shadow stretching long and distorted against the side of my house. She stepped out, wrapped in another one of her ridiculous fur-lined coats, her hair still in tight curlers, and Priscilla clutched tightly to her chest, the little dog yapping furiously at the darkness. Karen took a few hesitant steps toward my garage, her head tilted to one side as if listening for something, her free hand clutching a flashlight that flickered and sputtered in the cool, damp air. I held my breath, my fingers twitching with anticipation as she crossed the threshold of my driveway, the motion sensor in the ghost figure clicking softly to life. For a moment, there was only silence, a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to hang in the air like the breath of a long-dead specter. Then, without warning, the ghost figure exploded into life, its red eyes blazing in the darkness, the hidden smoke machine belching out thick, choking clouds of white fog, and the built-in speaker crackling to life with a bone-chilling whisper. "Get out," it hissed, the voice distorted and twisted by the cheap crackling speaker, each word drawn out like the last, gasping breath of a drowning man. Karen froze, her eyes wide with terror, the flashlight clattering to the ground at her feet as Priscilla let out a single terrified yelp and leaped from her arms, disappearing into the fog with a frantic scrabble of tiny claws against the gravel. For a heartbeat, she just stood there, her mouth hanging open, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and then, with a shriek that could have shattered glass, she turned and bolted for her minivan, her slippers flapping against the pavement like the wings of a panicked bat. I watched as she fumbled with the door handle, her fingers slipping on the cold metal, before finally wrenching it open and throwing herself into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, the tires screeching against the asphalt as she sped off down the street, the back of her van fishtailing wildly as she disappeared into the darkness. I leaned back in my chair, my heart still racing, and let out a long, satisfied breath, my grin stretching from ear to ear. I had won the first round, and as I sat there, listening to the distant sound of her van's engine fading into the night, I knew that Karen would think twice before blocking my driveway again. The next morning, I woke up with a deep, satisfying ache in my chest, the kind you get after a good workout or a long, overdue confrontation. I stretched, the old springs in my mattress creaking in protest, and let out a contented sigh as I thought about the way Karen had shrieked and bolted from my driveway the night before. It was the kind of victory that stays with you, the sweet, lingering taste of petty revenge that brightens your whole day. I made my way downstairs, the old wooden steps groaning under my weight, and poured myself a strong cup of black coffee, the steam rising in lazy curls as I leaned against the kitchen counter, watching the sun slowly creep over the tops of the maple trees that line the street outside. I half expected to see Karen's van parked in front of my driveway again, her way of doubling down on her nonsense, but to my surprise and slight disappointment, it was gone. In fact, the entire street was eerily quiet, the usual hum of lawnmowers and the distant shouts of kids playing tag strangely absent. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the bitter heat filling my mouth, and let my gaze drift over to my garage. The ghost figure still stood in the shadowy depths, its red eyes now dim, the thick fog from the night before having long since dissipated into the cool morning air. I couldn't help but chuckle, a low, satisfied rumble that echoed off the cracked kitchen tiles. Maybe I had finally scared her off for good. Maybe, just maybe, I'd bought myself a few weeks of peace. But as the day wore on, a nagging sense of unease began to creep into my mind, like the slow, insidious spread of mold in a dark basement. Karen was many things: annoying, entitled, downright infuriating, but she wasn't a coward. I had a feeling she wouldn't let this go so easily, and as much as I enjoyed the thought of her being too scared to step foot near my driveway again, I couldn't shake the image of her standing on my porch, eyes blazing with righteous fury, demanding to know why I had threatened her in her own neighborhood. I tried to push the thought from my mind, distracting myself with chores and the long overdue task of cleaning out my attic. But by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long twisted shadows across my lawn, the uneasy feeling had only grown stronger. I finished the last of my beer, the bottle clinking softly as I set it down on the kitchen counter, and peered out the window one last time before heading to bed. The street was still empty, the thick, creeping fog slowly rolling in from the woods, curling around the base of the streetlights like ghostly fingers. I shook my head, muttering a soft curse under my breath, and made my way upstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet as I climbed into bed, the old threadbare sheets cool against my skin. I drifted off to the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees, my mind filled with images of glowing red eyes and the terrified slack-jawed look on Karen's face as she fled into the night. But my sleep was far from restful. I dreamed of shadows moving in my garage, of cold, clammy hands reaching out from the darkness, of whispering voices calling my name from the depths of the fog. I woke with a start, my heart racing, the pale early morning light filtering through the cracked blinds, casting thin, jagged lines across my bedspread. I sat up, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and ran a shaky hand through my hair, the remnants of the nightmare still clinging to my mind like cobwebs. I stumbled downstairs, my bare feet slapping against the cold, wooden floor, and threw open the front door, half expecting to find Karen's van parked in front of my driveway, her angry face peering out at me from behind the windshield. But the street was empty, the fog now thick and oppressive, swirling around the base of my driveway like the breath of some great unseen beast. I took a slow, cautious step onto the front porch, my breath fogging in the cold morning air, and squinted into the mist. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement, a pale, ghostly shape darting between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone, swallowed up by the swirling fog. I shook my head, rubbing at my tired eyes, and stepped back inside, locking the door behind me with a soft metallic click. I tried to go about my day as usual, fixing a quick breakfast and thumbing through the pile of unpaid bills on my kitchen counter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier, the shadows in my house seemed darker, and every creak and groan of the old wooden beams sounded like a whisper, a faint, mocking echo of the ghostly voice I had programmed into my garage prop. By the time night fell, my nerves were stretched thin, my fingers trembling as I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows, my heart racing every time a shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. I made my way back upstairs, the creaking steps sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock, and slipped under the thin, scratchy sheets of my bed, pulling them up to my chin like a frightened child hiding from the monsters in his closet. I lay there, staring up at the cracked ceiling, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, and tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I had let my little prank get to my head. But as I drifted off into a fitful, uneasy sleep, the whispers returned, echoing through my mind like the rustle of dry leaves in a forgotten graveyard, their words twisted and distorted, but unmistakable. "Get out!" they hissed, their voices overlapping, blending together into a cacophony of ghostly wails, each word a cold, sharp stab of fear that set my teeth on edge. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest, and realized with a cold, sinking dread that the whispers weren't just in my head. They were coming from the garage. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the whispering voices grew louder, each word a sharp, icy blade that cut through the thin walls of my house, echoing up the stairs like the slow, deliberate footsteps of a long-dead ghost. I threw off my covers, my heart pounding so loudly I could feel it in my teeth, and stumbled to the window, my trembling hands fumbling with the dusty blinds as I peered out into the fog-shrouded street below. The thick, swirling mist clung to the ground like a shroud, obscuring the driveway and the dense line of trees that marked the edge of my property. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim, grey light, I saw it, the faint, flickering glow of red eyes peering out from the shadows of my garage, their hollow, unblinking stare cutting through the fog like a pair of bloodshot moons. My stomach twisted, a cold, slithering dread creeping up my spine as the whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping, blending together into a nightmarish chorus that seemed to rise up from the very ground beneath my feet. "Get out!" they hissed, the words stretched and distorted, each syllable dripping with malice, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was hearing. I hadn't activated the ghost figure since that first night, hadn't even stepped foot in my garage since then, and yet here it was, its red eyes blazing, its whispering voice filling the air like the mournful wail of a lost soul. I forced myself to take a deep breath, the cool, damp air filling my lungs like the icy grip of a phantom's hand, and made my way downstairs, my bare feet slapping against the cold wooden floorboards as I crept toward the front door, my fingers trembling as I reached for the rusty brass doorknob. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with 1,000 terrifying possibilities. What if the prop had short-circuited and caught fire? What if some twisted prankster had snuck into my garage, rewiring my creation for their own sick amusement? But as I slowly pulled the door open, the thick, cloying fog spilling into the narrow entryway like the breath of some great unseen beast, I knew, deep down, in the darkest, most fearful corners of my mind, that something far worse was waiting for me in that garage. I stepped out onto the porch, the old wooden boards creaking beneath my weight, and felt the icy tendrils of the fog wrap around my ankles, their cold, clammy touch sending a violent shiver up my spine as I made my way across the gravel driveway, each step crunching loudly in the oppressive silence. The red eyes flickered, their glowing orbs seeming to follow me as I approached, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps as I reached the edge of the open garage, the rusty metal door swaying gently in the chill morning breeze. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering just inches from the door handle, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to lock myself inside my house and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but something, some dark, twisted curiosity forced me to step inside, the cold, metallic air of the garage hitting me like a slap to the face. The whispers grew louder, the harsh, crackling voice of the ghost figure blending with the soft, mocking echoes of something else, something older, something darker, and as I took a shaky step forward, my boots scraping against the oil-stained concrete, I realized with a sickening jolt that the figure wasn't where I had left it. The mannequin, with its glowing red eyes and twisted claw-like hands, was no longer standing in the corner of the garage, its motion sensors primed to spring to life at the slightest movement. Instead, it had somehow shifted to the center of the room, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its long, spindly fingers outstretched as if reaching for something or someone. I took a slow, hesitant step back, my heart thundering in my chest as the whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping, blending together into a single, terrifying command. "Get out!" they hissed, and as the words echoed through the cramped, shadow-filled space, I felt a cold, clammy hand brush against the back of my neck, its long, skeletal fingers curling around my skin like the icy grip of the grave. I spun around, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, but the garage was empty save for the mannequin, its glowing red eyes fixed on me, its twisted plastic mouth stretched into a silent, mocking grin. I stumbled backward, my back slamming into the rusted metal workbench, and let out a choked, terrified scream as the figure took a slow, deliberate step toward me, its joints creaking, the tattered strips of cloth that hung from its skeletal frame rustling like dry leaves in a forgotten graveyard. I scrambled for the door, my fingers slipping on the cold, oily concrete as I threw myself out into the foggy morning air, the whispers still echoing in my ears, their ghostly voices blending together into a single mocking chorus that followed me all the way back to my front door. I slammed the door behind me, the old rusted hinges shrieking in protest, and collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving, my heart pounding like a sledgehammer against my ribs as the whispers slowly faded into silence, leaving me alone in the cold, dark stillness of my empty house. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my back pressed against the splintered wood of the door, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, until finally the first rays of sunlight began to creep through the cracked blinds, casting thin, jagged lines across the dusty floorboards. I stumbled to my feet, my legs trembling, my mind reeling with the impossible, terrifying reality of what I had just witnessed, and made my way to the window, my fingers trembling as I pulled the blinds aside and peered out into the fog-shrouded street below. The garage door was still open, the thick, swirling mist spilling out like the breath of some great, unseen beast, but the mannequin, my twisted, hand-built creation, was gone, its glowing red eyes no longer piercing the shadows, its hollow plastic grin no longer mocking me from the darkness. I let out a long, shuddering breath, my heart still racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had seen, and slowly sank to the floor, my back pressed against the cool wooden wall, my eyes wide and unblinking as the whispers echoed through my mind, their ghostly voices still ringing in my ears. "Get out!" they hissed, their words sharp and cold, each syllable a twisted, mocking echo of my own fear. And as I sat there, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, I realized with a cold, sinking dread that I had awoken something far older and far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined.